As a continuation of the cardinal manifestations, today we are going to discuss the general physical examination, basically the head to toe in cardiology. Many of you, most of the examiners will be asking that head to toe examination, you tell about this disease, this disease. So today we'll discuss what all findings we get in various cardiovascular diseases from head to toe and a basic about all that. So this is what I'm going to cover. Now, besides your vitals and your what you so called pickle, that is pallor, icterus, cyanosis, clubbing, lymphadenopathy, and edema, which we'll cover in short. These are the other things which in all cardiovascular general physical examination you should talk on. That is, I think you should every time you'll be talking on there are no signs of aortic regurgitation, there are no signs of Marfan's or Marfanoid habitus, and no signs of infective endocarditis. Apart from this, there are few other things which you should always consider telling in the general physical examination, which includes signs of any acute rheumatic activity. Fundus examination should be told in detail. Cutaneous markers of atherosclerosis. Suppose most of the times in MD examination, you may not get an coronary artery disease, but many a times you should always comment on this cutaneous markers of atherosclerosis, or you should know about this. Also, though it's very unlikely to get a case on atrial septal VSD case or a TOF case, you should always comment on there are external markers of congenital heart disease are there or not. So I'll come to it one by one. So the first thing to talk about is the cutaneous markers of atherosclerosis. So many of you may be knowing few of these markers, but let us discuss in detail one by one. Now, this is the most important thing, that is the xanthelismas and the xanthomas. We know these are the markers of atherosclerosis or hyperlipoproteinemia. If not seen, I think most of the cases with hyperlipoproteinemia or patients who are LDL very high, like more than 200, we should always look for this external markers. Now, xanthelismas are usually found near the inner canthus of the eyelid, as you can see in the picture below. So they are the typical xanthelismas, which are usually found more on the upper lid compared to the lower lid. Now, more commoner than this are the xanthomas, which you would have studied about. They are the eruptive, tendinous, and palmar xanthomas. Now, the picture down, you can see the various types of xanthoma. The eruptive over the tendons are the tendinous xanthomas, and over the hands are the palmar xanthomas. Now, this feature of hypercholesterolemia or hyperlipidemia is important because it can help us to tell the type of hyperlipidemia which we are dealing with. Just as a mnemonic, you can remember ATP. Instead of ATP, you can remember ETP. Type 1 is eruptive xanthomas, type 2 is tendinous xanthomas, and type 3 is palmar xanthomas. So these are the xanthoma we get in various hyperlipoproteinemia. But there may be some overlap among these types. So all the patients with hyperlipoproteinemia, or if a patient has some coronary artery disease, you should always look for these markers. Why? One is you can tell that these markers may respond to some new group of drugs, which we know as the PCSK9 inhibitors, which are a new anti-lipid drugs. Also, you can also screen in the family members, as it can be a homozygous or a heterozygous hyperlipoproteinemia. Mostly are the autosomal dominant or recessive. So in the family members also you can screen for these markers, or you can screen for the lipid profile. Now the next marker is Arcus juvenilis. As compared to Arcus senilis, which is seen in old age, Arcus juvenilis can be a marker of lipid deposition at the corneoscleral limbus. So you can see they are associated with hypercholesterolemia or xanthelismas or high blood pressure, cigarette smoking, and diabetes. And the more severe the Arcus, they tend to have the severe atherosclerosis. Next is what you see more commonly, that is the acanthosis nigricans. I think you may be knowing this in detail because this is a part of metabolic syndrome. And I won't go into detail what is metabolic syndrome, but all of you may be knowing the points of metabolic syndrome. That is the total cholesterol, fasting blood sugar, or a higher blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, or the waist hip ratio. So these are the various part of metabolic syndrome. So as a part of metabolic syndrome, we get what is known as acanthosis nigricans. It has both the hyperpigmentation and the hyperkeratosis. So there is the thickening of the skin associated with hyperpigmentation, and we see more commonly over the nape of the neck, also at the axilla, and rarely over the groin. And if you see this, you have to first think that the patient has an underlying insulin resistance or a metabolic syndrome. But one important thing is it is not only found in insulin resistant state, there are other endocrine diseases like Cushing syndrome also, or a polycystic ovarian syndrome you can get. And also it can sometimes be benign. You can get in obese patient who do not have metabolic syndrome. It can be a marker of an internal malignancy. Sometimes even a drug-induced acanthosis nigricans may be possible, or there can be a hereditary benign acanthosis nigricans. However, the most important point you should know it is a marker of hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistance. Now, the next is the skin tags. Now, most of us will be thinking the skin tags are actually benign, and they are most of the time they are benign. However, when the studies were done with the patients with coronary artery disease, they found that the skin tags or multiple skin tags may be a marker of hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistance states. Now, there are some other things like premature graying and balding. So the thing is that they are also telling that a premature graying or a early onset androgenic alopecia. So early onset androgenic alopecia may be a marker of coronary artery disease and also the frontal balding. They can also be related to coronary artery disease. Now, this is one important sign. Some of you would have heard earlobe crease, also known as a Frank sign. Now, if you see most of the patients with coronary artery disease, 1/3 of the patients you will see what is known as this earlobe crease. So you have to draw a line from the tragus 45° in 45° backwards into the auricle, and you see that there is a line. So this is known as a Frank sign or a earlobe crease. It is also seen in patients with a atherosclerosis or coronary artery disease. Now, there are some secondary markers which may tell that the patient has underlying risk factors like a nicotine chewing, and also nicotine staining sometimes can be a marker of underlying smoking associated or a coronary artery disease. And also what is known as a Brittle-Quit-Seller syndrome. This is usually seen in the populations like in Asian countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, where a lot of Brittle-Quit-Sellers are there. However, this Brittle-Quit can be associated with underlying coronary artery disease. Now, this is one of the important things which I told you under the topic of metabolic syndrome, central obesity. Now, what was before the definition is now changed. Now, the central obesity is defined as a waist circumference of more than 19 centimeter, 90 in South Asian men, and more than 80 centimeter in South Asian women. So if a male has a more than 90 centimeter abdominal or a central obesity, and a female is more than 80 centimeter, it is known as a central obesity and can be a marker of coronary artery disease. And not only coronary artery disease, it can be marker of diabetes or obstructive sleep apnea, various underlying malignancies, or degenerative diseases and high blood pressure. Now, apart from this, we know that peripheral vascular disease, like a blocks in the leg, blocks in the carotid artery, can be associated with coronary artery disease. So if a patient has underlying peripheral vascular disease that you are not able to feel the pulses in the lower limb, you should always suspect that the patient can have an underlying coronary artery disease also. Now, recently, one more concept is coming is gout and arthritis. So all the patients with coronary artery disease, we should always see for something known as hyperuricemia, because the high uric acid may be related to the not only to the presence of coronary artery disease, but also to the severity of coronary artery disease. So hyperuricemia can be a marker of not only high blood pressure, coronary artery disease, obesity. Even in patients with congestive cardiac failure, hyperuricemia is a poor prognostic sign. Now, you will be knowing that many patients with rheumatoid arthritis, they have underlying coronary artery disease. So this concept is patients with rheumatoid arthritis are at a higher risk of coronary artery disease. So you should always look for underlying markers of a rheumatoid arthritis, like a nodules, atrophy, or vitiligo, or something known as a pseudoxanthoma elasticum, or various vasculitis features, let it be livedo reticularis, or a palpable purpura, or a pyoderma gangrenosum, or a rheumatoid nodules. So the moral of the story is all the patients with rheumatoid arthritis, if they present with chest pain, you should always suspect the underlying coronary artery disease. And finally, one important concept of psoriasis. This is usually found in young population. If they have psoriasis, they present with chest pain, or a patient with coronary artery disease, if they do not have any other risk factor and they have only psoriasis, you should not forget that psoriasis can also be a risk factor for coronary artery disease. And one important point which I would like to focus is, patients with psoriasis, you should never give beta blocker. It's not an absolute contraindication, but beta blockers may increase the lesions of psoriasis in a patients with coronary artery disease or otherwise also. So be cautious to use beta blockers in patients with psoriasis. So these were the various signs of a underlying coronary artery disease or markers of atherosclerosis. I'll be happy if after going through this in all your cases, you will try to look for these markers from the next time. Now, the next most important thing is peripheral signs of aortic regurgitation, which I know that at the level of MD, you will be asked specifically the names of these markers. Now, before going to these markers, I would like to focus on few points. Like aortic regurgitation, we know that one of the most important, apart from the length of the murmur, is the presence of Hill sign, which we say is the severity of coronary artery disease. So is a marker of aortic regurgitation. So if a patient with AR has a systolic upper limb BP of 150 and a lower limb BP of some suppose 210, we know that the Hill sign, that is more than 60, is severe, 40 to 60 is moderate, 20 to 40 is mild, and less than 20 is normal. So, but we say that anything which is more than 40 mmHg, the difference between the upper limb and lower limb is significant Hill sign. But so at your level, I think the Hill sign you should always remember, it is most important sign of aortic regurgitation. So from head to toe, when you go, you should always look for all the signs. Now, the most important signs of aortic regurgitation is what is known as water hammer pulse. Now, when I next time when I discuss about the pulses, I will come to the collapsing pulse. Now, I think you should most importantly know how do you demonstrate a collapsing pulse. I will just brief on this. You should first see that the amplitude of radial pulse is very good. So the first prerequisite is it should be a good volume or a high amplitude bounding radial pulse. Now you take your fingers more proximally till you are able to not feel the radial pulse, and then you have to make a fist around your arm, and then suddenly you have to pick with the other hand, not the same hand, with the other hand you have to just raise the patient's hand above the head, and suddenly you will see that the pulse has collapsed. However, with the thinner prominence, you will be able to feel the the pulse via the ulnar artery. It means the patient has a collapsing pulse. So now I will come on to the next class, but this is how you demonstrate something known as a water hammer pulse. Now, next important sign is a Corrigan's pulse. So if you see at the area of carotid artery, you will see something known as a dancing carotids. So this is known as a Corrigan's pulse. And the most important thing is you should differentiate it from the JVP. Many people, the dancing carotid, they usually confused with the JVP, which you should not be happening, because we know the JVP is more medial, carotids are more lateral. JVP can be obliterated, however, cannot be obliterated. However, as carotid, you will be able to obliterate. With the respiratory variation, you may feel the JVP may increase or decrease, but the carotid don't increase or decrease with the abdominal movements, abdominal pressure, or respiratory variation. So, and JVP always have a two flickers. However, a carotid only has only one point of prominent pulses. So this is how you differentiate a carotid and a jugular venous pressure pulse. Now, apart from this, the most important thing is Hill sign, which I told you. You have to check the blood pressure in the upper limb. You have to check the blood pressure in the lower limb. If the difference is more than, is it okay? I can continue. Yeah. So if the difference is more than 20 mmHg, it means there is some Hill sign is there. However, more than 40 mm Hg is taken as significant. More than 60 is definitely severe. 40 to 60 is moderate. However, more than 40 you should take as a significant Hill sign. Now, one thing which I would like to focus is, at present, if you somebody asks you which is the most sensitive sign of a aortic regurgitation, it is not the Hill sign, but it is the Durozius sign. Now, Hill sign can be present in other high volume states also. However, the Durozius sign cannot be present in any other high volume state. So, what is Durozius sign is? You should remember 3 Ds: Durozius, distal, and diastolic murmur. So, at the femoral artery, if you occlude the artery distally, proximal to that, you will get a diastolic murmur. So over the femoral artery, obliterate the femoral artery, and then proximal to that, you get a diastolic murmur, which is known as a Durozius sign. Why it happens is, when you obliterate the femoral artery, there is an increased peripheral runoff. So that happens, which causes the Durozius sign. So systolic murmur, it is written as systolic murmur, but that is a part of that. So it can be it is also known as Traube's sign sometimes. So diastolic murmur is known as the Durozius sign. Otherwise, there you can also get the pistol short sounds, what is known as the Traube's sign. So over the femoral arteries. Now next sign is the de-Muset sign, that is the head nodding. Which each heartbeat there will be head nodding. It is known as the de-Muset sign. Now, next sign is the Quincke's sign, which usually you see the pulsations over the nail capillary bed. So what you can do is, either with your other finger, you can just press over or the blanch the finger, and then you can see the increased pulsation over the capillary bed. Otherwise, you can take a what is known as your microscopic slide, and then put pressure over the nail bed. Then you'll get something. Yeah, somebody can mute off, no? Yeah, thank you. So that is known as the Quincke's sign. Now next sign is the lighthouse sign, that is over the forehead. You can see the alternating blanching and the flushing of the forehead. So it is known as the lighthouse sign. Next sign is the Landolfi sign, which is the alternating constriction and dilatation of the pupil. That is known as the Landolfi sign. Becker sign, you know, is the visible pulsations over the retinal arterioles. So you have to do a fundoscopic examination and see that the retinal arterioles are pulsating. That is known as a Becker sign. Then what is known as Mueller sign is visible pulsations of the uvula. That is known as the Mueller signs. Then something known as two important signs are Rosenbach and Gerhardt. People always get confused. Just remember, Rosenbach is a pulsatile liver, whereas the Gerhardt sign is an enlarged pulsatile spleen. Then apart from that, few other signs which are not very important are the Lincoln, which is a pulsatile popliteal, and the dorsalis pedis is known as a Sherman sign. I think out of this, the most important which you should remember is, first is the Durozius signs, second is the Hill sign, third is the Corrigan's pulse. That is a one is a water hammer pulse, Corrigan sign, that is a dancing carotid, and you always look for the pistol sound over the femoral arteries. All others, if you are able to get, it's well and good, but this five signs you should always remember in your examination of AR. Also, again, re-emphasizing that Durozius sign has a sensitivity, that is sensitivity of 90 and specificity of 100, whereas the Hill sign has only a sensitivity of 69%. So these were all the peripheral signs of aortic regurgitation. I would like to wait for 2 minutes. If any questions are there, I would like to take. Anybody has any question?
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, is there a grading also in Hill sign where the difference of 20, 30, and 40 respectively signifies the severity of AR?
The Hill sign 20 to 40 is mild, 40 to 60 is moderate, more than 60 is severe, but it cannot tell you about the severe regurgitation. You can only say that more than 40 or more than 50 is a significant aortic regurgitation, but 20 to 40 cannot tell that it is a mild aortic regurgitation.
Okay, sir.
And not all, that is why the sensitivity comes into play. Not
Okay.
all the patients with aortic regurgitation will have Hill sign, and not all the patients with Hill sign have aortic regurgitation.
Okay, sir.
Any other questions?
So, Dr. Sudhakar, I will like to add one point to what you discussed very appropriately about the hyperuricemia.
Yeah.
So it is something like which is common question we as a rheumatologist keep getting consultation that this patient is hyperuricemia. Kindly advise on starting urate lowering therapy. So in a way, if patient has asymptomatic hyperuricemia and doesn't have gout, that's a clear-cut guidelines now. We should not start urate lowering therapy. But that doesn't mean that we should not treat those patients. In those patients, the treating factor will be what Sir pointed out, the comorbidities like hypertension, obesity, and diabetes or pre-diabetes. If those things are existing, that must be taken care. So that's at present treatment. You are not supposed to start allopurinol or febuxostat for a patient, even though the uric acid is 9, but there is no single episode of gout. You are not supposed to start it because it doesn't benefit in a long term. That's the main concern there, and that is something important to remember. And psoriatic and rheumatoid arthritis are also very important risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Actually, whatever our rheumatology patients are there of arthritis, they do not die of arthritis; they die of cardiovascular disease. So all those patients develop early or the premature atherosclerosis. That whenever you get a patient, always have a look on that cardiovascular risk. It is very important thing to take care. Other than arthritis, you should treat the comorbidity also. So that's from my side, and I think, sir, if any question we can address or we can continue.
Yeah. So I'll move to the next. If no questions, I'll move to the next peripheral. That is a science of Marfan syndrome. Now, this is something which is very important because we have tend in MD we tend to have a habit of not discussing this like a peripheral signs of Marfanoid habitus. However, if you get a case of aortic regurgitation, at least in those cases, you should be very strict in telling that there are no peripheral signs of Marfanoid or no Marfanoid habitus. Marfan syndrome may be different, but Marfanoid habitus is a different thing. So patient may not be having, but he is having all the findings which a patient with Marfan's has. So the various peripheral signs in a Marfan's include the most important head to toe being a supromedial subluxation of the lens. So many a times, if you see a patient with aortic regurgitation, young people, they have they have a specs, and then you have to think wisely that why this patient is having a specs with aortic regurgitation. So then when you ask the history, then the history that in the childhood there was a progressive or a sudden decrease in the vision. So there was a subluxation of the lens, and you can actually make out that there is a subluxation of the lens. So the Marfans usually have a medial subluxation of the lens, and the important is a similar disease like a homocystinuria can present with infratemporal subluxation of the lens. Now this is very important thing. Like people do ask what is the difference between the Marfans and the homocystinuria. So Marfans present with supromedial, whereas the homocystinuria present infratemporal subluxation of lens. Now there is one more difference is Marfans usually tend to have a high IQ as compared to the patients with homocystinuria who usually have mental retardation, if not all. So this is one important point of differentiation between the Marfans and a homocystinuria, and even both can be after some time for various cardiovascular diseases. Now the next important point is a high arched palate. Now there is actually, if you see, there is no clear-cut definition of a high arched palate. That is what a standard teaching is. You ask the patient to open the mouth, and from the straight, you heard the clinician ask the patient to stand straight, look forward, and open the mouth. Normally, posterior palate is usually visualized. However, in patients with high arch palate, the hard palate, that is the uvula, is not visualized. This is how we examine the high arch palate. There are various orthopedics books where there are some reference given to the definition. I'm not very sure. Somebody can look into it, but I think this see at the high arch palate. Now, why this high arch palate is important is not only the patient with Marfan's, but there are various other cardiac diseases where a high arch palate can be found. Now, next thing is a metacarpal index. Now, what is a metacarpal index? It is not a clinical sign, but it is a radiological sign, which in few clinical examination, people may ask you in a metacarpal index in Marfan syndrome. So what you have to do is to the fifth, the length of the second to fifth metacarpal divided by the width of the second to fifth metacarpal at the level of mid hand, means at the level of the mid part of the hand, this hand, you have to see the ratio and then decide. Now, any ratio which is more than 8.4 is taken as a significant metacarpal index, and which is usually found in Marfan syndrome. Now, thumb sign is very important sign. So what you have to do is, patient has, when a fist is made over a clenched thumb, normally if you can see, the fist does not extend beyond the ulnar side of the hand. However, in patients with Marfan syndrome, the fist extend beyond the ulnar side of the hand. So that is known as the thumb sign. Now, what is the wrist sign is, you overlap your thumb and the little finger, and you can see normally it doesn't overlap much. So if there is a significant overlapping of the thumb and the in wrist, this little finger at the level of the elbow, it is known as the wrist sign. Now, again, focusing on the metacarpal index, at the mid palmar level, the average length of the second to fifth metacarpal divided by average breadth of the second to fifth metacarpal, if it is more than 8.4, it is known as a high metacarpal index. Now, there are various other manifestations of Marfan syndrome. You should always focus on two important things: arm span and upper segment and lower segment ratio in all the cases of valvular heart disease. At least if not in a congenital heart disease, all the valvular heart disease, which will be your short case or rarely be a long case, always focus on the arm span, because normally the arm span is not more than the total upper segment plus low, or a total height of a patient. So if the arm span to the total upper segment to total height of the patient is more than 1.06, if the ratio is more than 1.05 or 0.6, it is suggestive of an underlying Marfanoid hepatitis or a Marfan syndrome. So an arm span more than the total height, or an arm span by total height ratio more than 1.05 may be suggestive of Marfan. Not only this, normally the lower segment is lesser than the upper segment, and the upper segment lower segment ratio is more than 1. However, in patients with Marfan syndrome, the upper to lower segment ratio is less than or equal to or less than 0.86. So these 2 points you should always remember, or you should always remember that the upper segment to lower segment is less than 0.86. And it is not only in Marfan syndrome, you may also get the similar thing in Klinefelter syndrome and homocystinuria. So homocystinuria, Klinefelter syndrome, and Marfan syndrome may have a upper segment ratio which is lesser than the lower segment ratio. However, there is a reverse of this. When the upper segment is too much more than the lower segment, which is usually normal, or it can be that is constitutional, or you can also get in a cases with acromegaly. So these two things are also important. Now, apart from this, the Marfans can have something known as the pectus excavatum. That is, there is inward protrusion of the sternum, or pectus carinatum, that is the outward protrusion of the sternum. They can also have a scoliosis more than 20 degree or a kyphosis. Now, apart from that, they can have something known as the spider fingers. That is, the fingers can go back and touch your hand. So these are the various findings. Now, various cardiovascular findings is, it can have severe aortic root dilatation and aortic regurgitation, or a mitral valve prolapse and mitral regurgitation. They can also have, rarely they can have aortic valve prolapse and aortic regurgitation. So these are the various findings of Marfan syndrome on a cardiovascular manifestations. They can also tend to have sometimes rarely spontaneous pneumothorax and all. So this is one important thing. Ocular, apart from the ectopial lentis, they can have retinal detachment and myopia. So these are the various in detail signs of Marfan syndrome. Any doubts, anybody? I can elaborate further. I am going slow because I think this is one of the important topics in a general cardiovascular examination, which all of you should know. So if no doubts, I would proceed to the next peripheral sign. So this is what I was talking about, the high arch palate. So high arch
Sir,
palate
I
can,
think Marfan's.
yeah,
Sir. Sir, I think Marfan's the lens dislocation. I thought it's superior temporal, sir. Then.
Yes, I think Marfan is
yeah,
temporal and
oh, yeah, I got it.
homocysteine is
Infromedial,
infromedial.
sorry, okay, I think there was a typo here. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So
Thank
Marfan
you
is
for
actually superior temporal and
supratemporal and
homocysteine is
infromedial.
infromedial. Yeah.
Right. So apart from this, the high arch palate is usually, it can be a normal variant or a patients with Marfan's. Apart from that, there are various other congenital diseases like the Turner syndrome, which you know, the XO, or which usually have webbed neck and a sealed shaped chest. May not be much important, but in cases with congenital heart diseases like coarctation of aorta and all, you have to remember this. Noonan syndrome may be associated with pulmonary stenosis, but they can also have, and Friedreich's ataxia. So these are just a few causes of a high arch palate. Now the next important is, I think, which you all will be telling in most of the general examination, is the signs of infective endocarditis. Now signs of infective or endocarditis, most of you will be telling the 5 typical things like the Roth spots, Janeway lesion, oscillar node, splinter hemorrhages. But the most important and the most common sign is not that, but it is a petechiae. So most common sign of a infective endocarditis apart from fever is a petechiae, which you should see in most of the patients. Then they can have fever. You should always look for pallor. You should look for clubbing, because it takes 2 weeks to develop clubbing in these patients with infective endocarditis. You should always look for splenomegaly. You should always look for caffeole spots, that is a light pigmentation, arthritis, any swelling, and a cardiac cachexia they can have. Now coming to the peripheral manifestation, this include most commonly the splinter hemorrhages, or what is known as the subungual hemorrhages. So they are linear streaks in the proximal nail beds. Oscillar nodes, you know, are the painful, and they are usually 2 to 5 mm and seen on the pads of the fingers or the toes. So those are the nodes. Then we have something known as the Janeway lesions, which are painless. So Janeway lesions are usually painless. They are macular red, hemorrhagic, and found on the palms and usually on the soles. So all the patients with endocarditis should at least look for the soles to see if any Janeway lesions are there. And you should always look for fundus to see any Roth spots, which are oval, pale retinal lesions and surrounded by hemorrhage. So as you know, few of these are embolic, whereas others are associated with immunological factor. So this we know that Roth spots and the oscillar nodes are due to vasculitis or the immunologically mediated, whereas Janeway lesions are usually embolic. So in all the patients with endocarditis, this peripheral signs you should always look for. So these are the Roth spots. You can see the pale center and the hemorrhagic periphery in the Roth spot. Oscillar node, which are usually painful on the tip of the fingers and the toes, and the Janeway lesion soles, and the splinter hemorrhages. Now, the next important thing is the signs of acute rheumatic fever or rheumatic activity. Now, this is one important thing, is because even if you get a patient with rheumatic heart disease like a mitral stenosis, mitral regurgitation, or a aortic regurgitation, which is rheumatic, you should always look for a sign of acute rheumatic fever. Now, why is this important? Is many a times the patient will be in a compensated stage, and underlying disease may usually activate the decompensate the patient, and acute rheumatic fever or a reinfection is usually one of the cause. So one of the important questions in most of your exam is they may ask you is, what are the various or 10 precipitants of a acute heart failure in a patient who is already compensated? So the first usually cause is usually infection. It's not the arrhythmia, but it is usually the infection which causes tachycardia, increases the left atrial pressure, and causes the pulmonary edema. The next important cause is usually atrial fibrillation or arrhythmia. The next important causes are usually activation of acute rheumatic fever, or it can be acute myocarditis, or acute ischemia can precipitate. An intake of alcohol can precipitate, anemia or a pregnancy can precipitate, or if the patient is not compliant with salt intake or water intake, or is compliant on medications, then that can precipitate. Even an acute episode of pulmonary embolism, though rare, can even precipitate. So these are various precipitants of a acute heart failure in a patient who is usually compensated. And so is the case with rheumatic heart disease. So you should always look for a sign of acute rheumatic fever, like if the patient has a history, always ask the patient with a history of fever, even if the patient has come with a mitral stenosis thing. Then you should see whether the arthritis, it should be painful, and it is usually migratory, and it is usually polyarthritis. However, the recent classification or recent criteria for acute rheumatic fever has even included the monoarthritis in high endemic states places. So Sydenham's chorea is usually rare, but you should always look for the signs of Sydenham's chorea. That is the pronator sign, wrist sign, or the reptilian tongue. So these are the various things. So the Sydenham's chorea, are quasi-purposive involuntary movements, which is usually associated with emotional lability. So they have various things known as, if you put the hand over the head, then the hand tend to pronate. That is known as the pronator sign. Then they have something known as a milkmaid sign or a spoon sign. That is, they have hyperextension of the fingers, or they have a reptilian tongue. So these are the various things which you have to see in a Sydenham's chorea. Erythema marginatum is very rare in countries like India, where we have usually some the darker population so it is usually difficult to find. Even the prevalence is very less than 2% or 1%. So erythema marginatum is a bright pink macules or papules on the extremities and on the trunk. So you should always look for erythema marginatum, though the prevalence is very low. And finally, the subcutaneous nodule, which is even more rarer than the marginatum. So usually they are small, firm, painless, and usually on the extensor surface of the bones and the tendons. So you should always look for these 5 signs of acute rheumatic fever in all the patients. Just to remind, the most common finding is arthritis. So acute rheumatic fever, most common finding is arthritis and not a carditis. And then you should always remember, arthritis and carditis are inversely proportional. So if a patient has more carditis, the chances of arthritis is very less, or if arthritis is more, the chances of carditis is very less. Also, if a patient has Sydenham's chorea, then the chances of carditis is very high. So carditis and Sydenham's chorea, and carditis and subcutaneous nodules always go together. In arthritis, you should always remember that even if you do not give any medication, this arthritis will resolve by themselves in 4 to 6 weeks. So one is that, and second, they have a very high means they respond very well with NSAIDs. So these two things are very important. And there are many differential diagnoses of arthritis, of acute rheumatic fever, like infective post-streptococcal arthritis, or a Neisseria gonorrhoeae, or many other arthritis, let it be malignancy related or gouty arthritis or rheumatoid. So you should always differentiate this arthritis from each other. Let it be a monoarthritis or a polyarthritis. So this is what the erythema marginatum, I told you, it is not classically seen in Indian population, but they are usually transient, macular, and non-pruritic. They have 1 inch diameter, usually found in trunks and proximal limbs. It blanches on pressure. And the other differential diagnosis may include a sepsis related or drug related or acute glomerulonephritis, and it may also be idiopathic. So it is not highly sensitive for rheumatic fever, but may be found in some other diseases also. Now, the next most important thing is what is known as a fundus examination. Now, I think at the level of MDI, most of you will be doing a fundus examination in all your cases. I would just like to focus a few important cardiac diseases which have important fundus finding. Diabetes, I won't go into detail. Most of you will know there are 6 stages. Starts from the edema, then they have a blot hemorrhages. They can have hard exudates. Then they can have cotton wool spots. They can have micro aneurysms, and then at the end they have neovascularization, which may lead to neovascular glaucoma. So these are the various fundus examination in a patient with diabetes mellitus, which you have to see. Then hypertension, I think this is the most common condition where you all will be seeing the fundus. And in a patient with accelerated or a hypertensive emergency or urgency, you will be looking for any papilloedema and other things. But according to the Kith Wegener, There are 4 stages. So the first stage is what is known as a arteriolar attenuation with a broadening of arteriolar right reflex. So arteriolar attenuation is one important thing. Then there is something known as the arteriolar narrowing. Then they can have something known as the cotton wool spots, again blot hemorrhages, and in the end they can have something known as the copper wiring or a silver wiring, and then finally papilloedema. So various hypertension related findings. It is important at your level that you should know the classification of Keith-Wegener in your exam. Now, if a patient presents you with hyperlipidemia and all, you should always look for something known as the white or a chalky fundus that is known as the lipemia retinalis. So the fundus in that is a hyperlipidemic vascular lesions, whitish color of the vessels and the lipid infiltrations into the retina. And the most important thing is it does not decrease the visual acuity of the patient. You will have a chalky white retina that is known as a lipemia retinalis. And you usually find in patients with lipoprotein lipase deficiency and what is where there is the increased levels of triglycerides. Now, infective endocarditis, I already discussed. You get what is known as the Roth spots. There is another condition which is known as the Eisenmenger syndrome, which is an important cause of cyanotic heart disease. So patients with pre-tricuspid or post-tricuspid shunt, they develop severe PAH and then they develop bidirectional shunt and then finally right to left shunt. So they have a Eisenmenger syndrome. And in all these cases where polycythemia they have, we should always look for fundus examination where we get engorged vessels, blot hemorrhages, microaneurysms, papilloedema, and the other findings. However, you should just know that these findings do exist in Eisenmenger syndrome. And then one important disease that is known as the autoarteritis or a Takayasu arteritis. The important thing is the disease Takayasu was first described by somebody known as a Takayasu who was an ophthalmologist. And he described that various ophthalmological findings of this disease. The most common finding is usually a ischemic neuropathy because there is a arteritis narrowing, and so the most common finding is a ischemic neuropathy. Sorry, it's not neuropathy, it's wrongly written. So ischemic changes, and typical findings include retinal venous congestion. You can have a fluorescein staining, capillary dropout, microaneurysms, and AV shunting. And the unusual findings are cotton wool spots, anterior ischemic optic neuropathy, and a retinal emboli. However, the ischemia is the most important thing which you should know. And finally, an important disease that is a coarctation of aorta, which is one of the important cause of secondary hypertension apart from many other secondary causes of hypertension. Most of the postgraduate, I do ask what are the most secondary hypertension various causes. They forget to mention the coarctation. That is one of the important cardiac causes. Apart from the discrepancy of the pulses in both the upper limb or a upper and lower limb and a radiofemoral delay and a murmur over the back, that is the collateral murmurs, you should always look in the fundus examination what is known as the corkscrewing. So you get what is known as the corkscrewing of retinal arterioles. So the corkscrewing, that is the U-shaped tortuosity of the retinal arteriole, is seen only in coarctation but not in other condition, and this is very important. So these are the various fundus examination finding you have to see in various cardiac diseases apart from something known as the Hollenhorst plaque. So Hollenhorst plaques are also a manifestation of atheroemboli. So atheroemboli in the fundus can lead to Hollenhorst plaques. Now, many of you people will be asking you what are the various causes of jaundice. So the causes of jaundice in a cardiac disease includes congestive cardiac failure, ultimately leading to cardiac cirrhosis. So a right-sided heart failure, which is chronic, can cause what is known as cardiac cirrhosis, and the patient may present with jaundice. Pulmonary infarction is also a cause of jaundice. Prosthetic valves. So patients who have a prosthetic valve, they do have hemolysis, which can cause jaundice. And apart from that, beta hemolytic streptococcal infection also are responsible for jaundice. Otherwise, various devices which we put like ASD, VSD, PDA, at the date, they usually come with hemolysis and jaundice and hemolytic anemia jaundice. So that is also one of the important cause of jaundice in a patient with cardiac disease. Now, external markers of congenital heart disease. I won't go into detail in each of this, but this is one of the important things I think you will be knowing more better at the level of MD, because few of these markers, before going to the disease, I would like to tell is low set of years. So low set of years is one important thing, that because you have to draw many congenital heart disease, you find a low set of years. So you have to draw a line from a lateral canthus to the out, and if less than 1/3 of the ear is above that line, normally more than 1/3 of ear is above that line. So if less than 1/3 of ear is above that line, then it is known as a low set of ears. Then low hairline. So it is a posterior hairline is below the level of fifth cervical spinous process. This is one of the definition of a low hairline. What is short neck? You will be knowing the ratio between the height and the distance between the external occipital protuberance to the C7 spinous process. So the ratio between the height and the distance between the external occipital protuberance to the C7 spinous process normally is below 12.8. Short neck, the ratio is more than 13.6. Hypertelorism is nothing but an increased interpupillary distance. So this is one more definition of hypertelorism is it said. Why this is important is many other cardiac disease telorism is seen. So if the intercanthite distance is more than the 50% of the interpupillary distance, then also you can call it a hypertelorism. So this you can see various cardiac diseases. Most common is a Turner syndrome, which is associated with hypertelorism. Apart from that, Noonan syndrome, Leopard syndrome, then Williams syndrome. I think Williams syndrome most of you would have heard because it is associated with supravalvular aortic stenosis, which also has the hypercalcemia, idiopathic hypercalcemia, supravalvular AS, and hypertelorism. So this is about the Williams syndrome. And then various other, that is not much important at your level, but you should just know the names of the diseases associated with hypertelorism. Now, I won't go into again detail, but few of the diseases I think you should know, because in exam you may get few diseases, few of this case, and they may ask you markers. So Down syndrome, there are various more than 15 to 20 external markers. The most important being the short stature, mongoloid facies, brachydactyly, short neck, simian crease can be there, bulging tongue can be there. There can be forehead abnormalities, nose abnormalities, bulging tongue can be, and many other abnormalities. But these are the important ones. And we know that Down syndrome is most commonly associated with atrial septal defect, and other important things are AV canal defects. And then we can have VSD and patellar arteriosus. There is one important disease we rarely encounter, what is known as Ellis-Van because it is usually associated with single atrium. So I have put a picture of Ellis-Van next to that. Patient usually has a short limbs, polydactyly. You can see on the image there is polydactyly. Nails are dysplastic. You can see genu valgum and a lip tie. So these are the various manifestations of Ellis-Van-Creveld. Evans-Serre syndrome, you know, is a mitochondrial disease, though it has some cardiac abnormalities like patient with ptosis, ophthalmoplegia, and retinitis pigmentosa. Also, in the cardiac manifestation, patient can have AV block or a complete heart block. Many patients, some patient can have known as TOF is usually associated with CHARGE syndrome. I won't go into detail, but you should always remember about the Turner syndrome, but because you may be getting into some medical other diseases with Turner syndrome. So patient will have short stature, webbed neck, very short neck, low hairline, low set of ears, sealed chest, that is widely spaced nipple, and the patient may present with a deafness and all. So Turner syndrome is both commonly found in coarctation and aorta, and they can have a bicuspid aortic valve also. Now, this is the charge association. Usually told you that the patient with the pathology of Fallot can have. Now, there are other important syndromes, are a Holt-Oram syndrome. We usually see in ASD, where you get a abnormalities of the radial abnormalities. So the radius can have the abnormalities, and there is a hypoplasia of the thumb. And there is the hypoplasia of the thumb, and they can have absent radius also sometimes. It is usually associated with atrial septal defect. Leopard syndrome, go into detail, but is usually associated with pulmonary stenosis. And again, DiGeorge syndrome, if you would have heard of, patient with tetralogy of Fallot have something known as a DiGeorge syndrome. They can present with hypocalcemia. DiGeorge is usually associated with the hypocalcemia, and then they can have other abnormal. Noonan syndrome is again an important. We can get pulmonary stenosis in patients with Noonan syndrome. And one important disease which I think in endocrinology you would have is Lawrence Moon Beadle syndrome. Patient has obesity, polydactyly, syndactyly, and retinitis pigmentosa, and they can have a wide variety of congenital heart disease. So this is a Dijot syndrome. You can see the micronathia, low set of ears, hypertelorism, and the sternotomy scar telling that there was a previous surgery the child underwent. You can have can be most commonly associated with the tetralogy of Fallot. These are the various other diseases. Williams disease syndrome, I already told you, associated with Elfin facies is a typical finding. Elfin facies or a broad flat nose and a peg-shaped teeth. It is usually associated with supravalvular aortic stenosis. So this is how the Elfin facies look: a short stature, mental retardation, broad forehead. They can have hypertelorism and they can have upturned nose. And these are various syndrome. I won't go into detail, but one important thing you should remember is in a case with PDA, patent ductus arteriosus, which has usually a continuous murmur. There are a lot of causes of continuous murmur. I think you should read it. I'll discuss it in our other class when we discuss the continuous murmur. But a PDA is usually associated with rubella syndrome. Maternal rubella is one of the important causes of PDA, and they have a triad of cataract, they can have deafness, and they can have retinopathy. So retinopathy, deafness, and cataract is a triad of maternal rubella syndrome, and they usually are associated with PDA and pulmonary stenosis both. Now, apart from the many causes of ascites, cardiac conditions can cause like a right-sided heart failure or a cardiac cirrhosis can cause ascites. Patients who have an underlying tricuspid valve disease, it can be hypertensive tricuspid regurgitation with PAH or an organic tricuspid valve disease with a tricuspid regurgitation or a tricuspid stenosis can present with ascites. Constrictive pericarditis, as I discussed in the last class, and I think he has shared among the group, they usually have something known as the ascites precox. Patient typically present ascites without pedal edema or a facial swelling, and there are various reasons for them to have a ascites before the swelling in any other part. So that ascites precox. Restrictive cardiomyopathy is one of the disease which presents with right-sided heart failure, pedal edema, ascites, fatigue. So RCM is one of the important causes of ascites, apart from Budd-Chiari syndrome, which causes hepatic vein thrombosis, and thus ascites. So these are the various causes of ascites in cardiac diseases. Now, this is the one of the important topics is clubbing. So I won't go into the detail, but at the level of MD, you will be knowing the various grading of clubbing. Grade 1 is your something known as your Lovie-Bond angle or the Samroth angle, which gets obliterated. And then you have grade 2 parrot, and then grade 3 drumstick or drumstick parrot beak, and grade hypertrophic osteoarthropathy. Now, cardiac diseases with clubbing, the most common cause of clubbing in cardiac disease is cyanotic congenital heart disease. So all the patients with cyanotic congenital heart disease, because they have right to left shunt causing hypoxia, they do clubbing. And apart from the acquired diseases, which are the acquired diseases are infective endocarditis, as we discussed, can cause clubbing. Pulmonary AV malformation. So pulmonary AV malformation is one more cardiac disease which cause clubbing. And then we have atrial myxomas. Atrial myxomas can cause clubbing. We know that atrial myxoma can have a triad of embolic phenomena, constitutional finding, and others. So clubbing is one of the important finding of a atrial myxoma. Now the theories of clubbing is, you will be knowing, one of the important thing is in a patient with cyanotic congenital heart disease, because there is a right to left shunt, the blood bypasses the pulmonary circulation. It doesn't go to pulmonary circulation because of one, the pulmonary stenosis is two, there is a right to left shunt. So all this blood bypasses the pulmonary circulation and go into the systemic circulation. They get deposited over the nail beds, and then they release something known as a platelet-derived growth factor, which causes the clubbing, the of the collagen, and cause clubbing. Then there are other theories like the ferritin theory. You have other theories like a genetic theory. Then there are the idiopathic causes of clubbing, and then the neurogenic theory. So these are the various theories of. I won't go into detail the extra cardiac causes of clubbing, which you will be dealt in the other classes. Yeah. So scars. So one important thing is if you get a congenital heart disease, you should always look for a scars in them. Like either they can have a central scar, which can be suggestive of a central shunt or a CABG. They can have a left thoracotomy scar. So left thoracotomy scar is suggestive of either the patient would have underwent a closed mitral commissurotomy. In the prior era, we used to do closed mitral commissurotomy, so that can have lateral thoracotomy scar. PDA surgeries are usually done through the left thoracotomy scar. Coarctation of aorta surgeries are done through the left scar. DT shunt, I won't go into detail. These are some shunts which we do in various congenital heart disease. They are done to the left side. CABG can rarely be done to the small scar over the left thoracotomy, and PA pulmonary artery banding. Right scar is usually associated with port shunt, Watterson shunts. These are usually the central shunt, some central shunt. TVR, that is tricuspid valve repair and mitral valve repair. So repair and replacement, they are usually done to the right scar, and atrial septal defect is usually closed. Surgical closure is done through the right side. So, and apart from that, there are various nail findings which I did not told in detail. Some congenital heart disease, surgery for a like a single ventricle, what is known as Fontans. The patient can have a hypoalbuminemia and can have 1.5 nails, half and half nails, also known as half and half nails. And then there are various diseases of like a systemic sclerosis, which can be associated with cardiac disease that can have a nail findings. So there are various nail findings also in cardiac. So this is how about the head in cardiology. I would like to conclude here. Any questions I would like to take?
I think, sir, before we go for question, I would like to thank you. It was actually a lucid presentation and almost everything which is required for our final year case. It is covered very properly. And I think each slide is a Viva question. So we will be sharing with you, and you should make a list. In addition to what sir has discussed, one more important point what you should be doing is we try to remember this pattern. Okay, Turner syndrome has this cardiac defect. Then Nuna's has this cardiac defect, but you have to make a list which is in reverse direction. What are the syndrome associated with ASD? What are the syndrome associated with PDA? What are the syndrome associated with VSD? Because in exam, ultimately, you are getting a diagnosis like that. So from there also, you should know how to go further for 2-3 differential or 2-3 syndromic diagnosis to tell. So that's the one thing which is very important. Second, what was the last point discussed? The scars. The scar should never ever be missed in general examination. Whatever scars are there, you have to describe it. If it is missed, that tells that you have not seen your patient head to toe, and in major case, it becomes a big issue. So always never ever miss any scar, skin finding, or even though you think it is not relevant for your case, still mention it in your case sheet. It is very important thing. So that might be the point sometime that you do not go ahead in your exam. So that is something which should not be missed. And third point, I will just add one in Viva, that people keep asking what are the causes of clubbing which gets reversed. Once developed, it gets reversed. So majority of the causes what you can treat, specifically the infective endocarditis, empyema, lung abscess, or even post-transplant, the malignancy and bronchiectasis related clubbing also gets reversed. So that's one of the question which is commonly asked in Viva. So you should be knowing. And I think now from students, if there are questions, we can definitely take.
I
If
think no
no
questions.
question, yeah, should we conclude?
Yeah.